Welcome to Outboard Motorbike. Today's expose is going to be explaining how we get the drive from our little bevel gearbox down to the input shaft, clutch shaft for the Harley gearbox with the chain and react the load between the two of them. Now you may recall we've got this little bearing from Harley Davidson, standard bearing out of the Harley primary drive that goes on that inner track and takes the load off the gearbox input shaft there. But we're going to mount that in this plate that goes between the two shafts using this little housing. And there's a trick there which I'll show you if you're interested. Now, this is something I've done before and which I quite like. If you mount the bearing directly in the plate, that's just a slide fit basically. You can use, obviously it takes the load into the plate really nicely. And that's a cover that the bearing sits in and a clamp plate. These bits are easy to make on my little lathe, very simple, but I don't have a dividing head in the mill to put those 6 mounting holes in. But because this bearing locates in the plate, you can use that to locate the housing on top of the bearing, which is in the plate. And then these laser cut holes, which are accurate, can be used to drill through and put the holes in the right place. And the clamp ring goes in like that, holds everything in place. They're tapped for through bolts, and got the whole thing tied up very neatly and quite easy and not too expensive. And with that bearing now mounted in the plate, you may recall that the centre distance of the two holes in this plate are 141 mil, which is the correct calculated centre distance for 50 links on a 1/2 inch chain around an 18 tooth sprocket here and a 36 tooth sprocket on the Harley clutch. And the gearbox and housings and etc. have been designed to accommodate with a little bit of slotting of holes that distance. It can be adjusted with some shims under here or there. And with that plate in place, by the time it's clamped in, that provides a nice reaction for the load of the chain trying to pull those two shafts apart, and a little bit to stop it disappearing that way as well. With the bearing plate and the clutch in place, we're going to now get on and make a clutch cover to keep all the oil in, which involves this laser cut ring, mounting flange I suppose you'd call that, and about 30 M5 screws to hold it in place, like so. And I've rolled up a bit of aluminium to go in there, and you can see what's going on there, can't you? The tricky bit's going to be keeping this all flat as I weld it up, because it's got potential to end up a total mess, but I think I've got a procedure for that. Here's our clutch cover, the sheet metal rolled up and tacked in place, and the flange still fits the backing plate, which is nice. Now we need to make a lid for it, or else all the oil will pour out there. And there might be a little bit of complication here because that doesn't need to be quite that deep there, and might be in the way of the rider's knee, so we'll see. There's our clutch cover. There's a roughed out piece of metal for the lid, but I won't trim that and weld it on like it is, because it's going to be a lot nicer, stronger and better looking if it's got a bit of shape in it. So I'll run that bit through the English wheel a few times and put a bit of a curve on it. It's not actually an English wheel, it's a Chinese wheel, which is like an English wheel but poorly made. Does the job though. There's our little bit of shin clearance added, and before I make that dome shaped, I've actually just put a little bend in it. So it fits on like that. that was done with the English wheel as well. It's quite a good tool for, as a set of rollers. Apart from stretching things, you can just use it to put a bend in. And then if I just stretch all this material, it'll end up with a little dome in it, and we'll be ready to join it on. Don't know how well you can see it, but that's been through the English wheel for 5 minutes or so, just to put a slight dome on that surface, so it's not a flat panel. So we can now trim it up, knock off the edges and weld it on there. That's trimmed up to fit now, and you may be aware of my aversion to sharp corners, but rather than make a 90-degree square weld around here, going around with this little tool, which puts a radius on the edge. It's a long job, but worth it, because you end up with a nice little radius with a weld on it rather than just a square corner. Back shortly. There we go. Didn't take that long really. And the tool is just a bit of 25 by 6 steel flat bar with a hacksaw cut in it. So anyone can make one of those. Same edge treatment for the lid, and weld it all together. And there it is, tacked together, nearly finished. I thought it was time to bolt it on and see what it looked like. Fairly happy with that. And it's probably clean enough that I could polish it, which isn't normally me, but bearing in mind it's covering over a Harley Davidson clutch, it's probably not completely inappropriate. And it needs a drain plug and a filler plug for the oil. Apart from that, she's done, mate. Moving right along, I've got the back half of the bike assembled here, specifically so I can have a look at sneaking the exhaust out underneath the gearbox. This is where it needs to go. And I've done the same sectioning of the pipe as I used for the water outlet as a head start, as a starting point, which I think will work out alright. And fortunately, there's room to get the pipe, straight pipe, past the gearbox and down there under the frame where it needs to go. So we'll proceed with that project on the bench. And as a next step, we've got the frame mounted to the sandwich plate with the exhaust outlet flange. So we can position that to miss the frame by 5 or 8 mil up there and start making our exhaust outlet. And there's the first bit of pipe in place. Just tack there while we get on and make the rest of it. And it comes up with a bit of bolt clearance and a few other things. Past the side of the frame there. There we go. And here's a complete aside. I don't know what note that is, but if the motorbike doesn't work, we can start a band. Moving right along, there's that piece removed from the jig so we can carry on with it. And there's the next little bit of smashed up pipe. It drops in there like that. A bit of luck. Weld that in place, fill up the gaps. Looking good. There's our first half finished. Hey, time for round 2. And there we go. That funny looking little pair of trousers is the end of that exercise. Should be bright.